Today, we're exploring the life of a young man from Wallacestown, Ontario, Canada. Someone whose name you may not know, but whose courage at Vimy Ridge helped shape the story of Canada in the First World War. His name was Ellis Sifton. He was a farmer, a son, a brother, a young man who grew up in a rural community not unlike so many across this country, and yet on April 9, 1917, he performed an act of bravery that earned him the Victoria Cross, which is the highest military honor in the Commonwealth. But here's the thing, most Canadians have never heard of him, and that's what I want to explore today. Why does someone like Ellis Sifton, someone whose actions were so extraordinary, fade from our national memory? Why does he matter today, and what does his story tell us about the communities that raised him and the country he fought for? Thank you for joining me for episode number 26 of Memory and Valor. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thanks for joining me again at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. As I've said before, this podcast is about resurrecting the sacrifices of veterans and soldiers who served in the First World War, specifically the Canadian Expeditionary Force. Every now and then we might deviate from that here and there, but generally this is a Canadian First World War podcast, and that's going to be reflected here quite a bit today. We're talking about a Canadian man who did something so extraordinary at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which is the main battle of the First World War that really gave Canada a place at the table in the Commonwealth and at the table when it came to the signing of the Treaty of Versailles. So thanks for joining me here, and let's get on with the show. So to help answer these questions about Ellis Sifton, I'm going to be joined later by Blair Ferguson. Now, he's an amateur historian from Wallacestown, Ontario, who has spent years researching Sifton's life and leading the effort to build Dutton Dunwich's first cenotaph, a project that finally brings Sifton's name into public view in his own hometown. Now, just a wee bit more about Blair Ferguson. He says his love of military history came mostly from his father, who was in the Royal Canadian Air Force in the Second World War, and his father was a pilot in Hawker Hurricanes in the RAF number 263 Squadron. Both of his grandfathers served in the First World War in the Royal Flying Corps, and the other in the Canadian Field Artillery. He also had a great-grandfather in the First World War who was an infantry officer, and a great-uncle who was a private in the infantry and was gassed at the Battle of Lens. So Blair says that his family's military history stretches as far back as records exist, and if a war was being fought, the Fergusons were there. So before Blair and I get into this conversation about Ellis Sifton, I just want to set the stage a wee bit. So Ellis Sifton was born in 1891 in Wallacestown, Ontario. He grew up on a family farm. He attended the local Anglican church, and he was known as a steady, reliable young man. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't chasing adventure. He was simply someone who believed in duty. So when the First World War began in 1914, he enlisted. He trained with the 18th Battalion, and like so many men of his generation, he found himself on the Western Front. We know about him today largely because of his correspondence that he wrote home, dozens of letters which survived untouched for decades. They reveal a young man who was thoughtful, grounded, and increasingly aware of the dangers he faced. But I'm not going to tell Sifton's whole story here because that's what Blair is here for. So that being said, let's welcome Blair to the show. Blair, thank you for joining me again.
There you go. Okay.
Okay, so why don't we start with the basics then? And so I'll just say it again for listeners who may not know. Who was Ellis Sifton?
So Ellis Sifton was just a ordinary, everyday Ontario farmer. He had two older sisters. His mother died when he was quite young from pneumonia. And of course, they lived with his father, John, on their home farm right in Wallacestown.
Right.
I should say that Ellis Sifton was very religious. They were Anglican, and was part of the church choir. He, I guess, what you would call a country gentleman. He had signed papers that he would never partake of alcohol, the evils of
Oh,
alcohol.
down with the demon
And
rum.
yeah, and so they were a pioneer family who had married into another pioneer family. So they were a well-connected family in the area.
Okay. And he
Um,
was born in Ontario, correct? Right?
yeah, he was actually
Yes.
born in his grandfather's house.
Cool.
Actually, his grandfather had a stagecoach stop, like so
Oh,
what we would call a hotel. And he was born there, and it's just down the road from my house. Yeah, and never left.
yeah.
The farthest he ever would have went was Dutton, which is a 10-minute drive, but back then it was nothing but horse and buggy. They were a well-respected family. He was a member of the Wallacestown Sportsman's Club, and he had won, best shot and things like that. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
Sounds like he
you know,
had a pretty stable, wholesome upbringing, lots of love
yeah,
in the family, that kind of a,
very,
yeah.
very close-knit family. And his cousins lived, down the lane. And they were very close with them as well. And his sisters basically raised him because his mom died when he was young. So,
Did
yeah.
his father ever remarry? Or
No, no,
so the
no, never.
sisters kind of stepped up to help raise the younger
Yeah.
ones?
He was reading the paper one day shortly after World War One broke out. And he read an article about how the Germans were treating Belgian farmers.
Mm,
And in his mind, he pictured his father and his sisters and imagined if they were in that situation, would they be treated that way? And because of that, he enlisted. He felt that
okay.
it was his duty to go and help, somebody who basically was him, like
Yeah.
his family just across the ocean, though. And so he thought that he should be able to go and do whatever he could
Yeah.
to right a wrong.
That's interesting that his motivation was empathy. It sounds like more
Yeah,
than,
you hear so much about how young men joined for adventure or to see
hmm.
the world or whatever. Well, his was strictly altruistic.
Wow.
I'm going to help farmers. So yeah, he was a very dedicated individual.
Sounds like a decent human being.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
people have asked me, did he have girlfriends or anything like that? And I've never,
Hmm.
in all my research, come across any mention of a young woman or anything like that. Not, I don't. It's not like he wasn't interested or whatever, but
Yeah.
his dedication to his family, to the farming, to the community, and I'm sure if it wasn't for the war, he probably would have married one of the local farmers' daughter.
Yeah. He had some militia experience, didn't he? Wasn't he a member of the Wallacestown Rifles? Is that true?
Yes, yeah,
What was
yeah.
the population of Wallacestown at the start
At
of the
that
First World
time,
War?
probably not much different than it is now. Probably around 250 people, 300 people.
Still pretty
Yeah,
small. Okay.
yeah,
So
yeah.
very well known in his town and well
Absolutely. Yeah,
respected. Okay.
yeah,
So then
yeah.
so war breaks out and he like you said he pictures his sisters, his father, what it would be like, if his family were on the other side of things there in Belgium. And so he enlists. Did he have to go into say Toronto or where did he enlist?
We went to St. Thomas. And St. Thomas at that time only had a militia regiment, the 25th Regiment of Infantry. Years later, they would end up having the 91st Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Force, but that wasn't until 1916, late 1916. So he enlisted in the 25th, and they signed him in, took the king's shilling type of thing.
Yeah.
And then they sent him to London, where he was again enlisted into the 18th Battalion of the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Okay, there we go.
Already were established. And London's, fair-sized community at that time.
Yeah. And for our listeners, we're talking about London, Ontario at this point.
Right. Yeah, not London, England. No, London, Ontario.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So he gets to London, and he's with the 18th. And from there, then he's going to get, does he do training? Does he go over to Valcartier in Quebec for training?
Not yet. No, they do training right in London at Wolseley Barracks.
Okay.
And Wolseley Barracks, even at that time, was quite old. It was built shortly after the War of 1812, named after Garnet Wolseley, the Nile expedition and all that sort of stuff. And that's where the Royal Canadian Regiment is still stationed at Wolseley Barracks today.
Right.
We're at that time as well. So they started doing training there, and they did marches and stuff like that. And it's interesting to note that, he had cousins that lived in London that he had never met, because they lived in London and he lived in Wallacestown, and that was a major excursion at that time.
Right.
So he went and visited his cousins for the first time in his life. And just kind of, for the listeners, how remote rural Ontario was at that time, you know, and also how connected he was to his community. He just clearly never felt he needed to go beyond his immediate community. Yeah, they could get everything he needed, I guess, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, he went to London and he started training there, and he automatically started writing letters. So throughout his military career, he wrote 98 letters to his two sisters. And the letters are very generic, kind of, did the barn get painted? What crops did Dad put in? How's, Grandma's knees? And that's important to note, because his letters, you can tell the change the war had on him through his letters. And his letters, the whole time he's in London, are very much the same. In one letter, he talks about men going to a dance, and he volunteered to stay on guard duty at the barracks because he didn't want to face the temptations of that,
the feminine wiles.
Yeah, that's right. Loose women and whatnot. And his letters continue on. He talks about training. They marched from London to Port Stanley, which is quite a march. That's like a 45-minute car ride. So that's a long walk.
Yes.
Long walk. So yeah, they did that, and they did, marching, polishing buttons, learning to salute, all that sort of stuff, all the stuff that they still do in basic training.
Right.
Once basic training was done, then yes, they went to Valcartier, and then from Valcartier to Halifax, and then from Halifax to England.
Right. And do you have off the top of your head his enlistment date?
23rd of October, 1914.
Oh, 14.
So 25th, yeah. Yep. So on October 23rd.
1914.
Yeah, October 23rd, 1914.
He didn't waste any time.
Right in the get-go. In the get-go.
I
Yeah.
think,
Yeah.
what you've told us and that date just says so much about him as a person. And I'm kind of, in a sense, just enamored by the kind of guy he was.
Yeah, he's a very interesting character for
Yeah.
sure.
Real gentleman.
Um, yeah, yeah, absolutely, country gentleman.
So he's off in Valcartier doing his training. And did he do the standard kind of like 4 to 6 months over there?
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
I don't even think it was that long.
Maybe
Um,
not in the beginning. Yeah.
yeah, no, it was a fairly short stint, just long enough for their clothing to rot off them, and
Yeah.
because they've rained the whole time.
Right.
Um,
He
Same thing
heads over
happened then.
to England. Does he go to Salisbury?
Yes, went to
To,
Salisbury Plains. And again, his letters, he talks about the similarities in
Hmm.
farming techniques. Like, other people would comment about so many other things, that, it's a different country and people. And, I'm sure a lot of guys would go to pubs and things like that.
Yeah.
He writes about how farming techniques are so similar, and they grow the same crops and whatnot. So yeah, I think he probably felt somewhat at home,
Yeah.
being seeing the surrounding farmland and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah.
And then things start to change. He gets over to France. He starts to see action, and his letters home, they take a turn, don't they?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Almost immediately, and one of the first things that a lot of Canadians witnessed when they went over, there was a famous cathedral,
Mm.
that had the Virgin Mary on top of the steeple, and it
Yes.
had been bombed, and she was pointing down at the ground.
Yeah.
And so many men have written about that, and including Ellis Sifton,
He did write
how
about that.
yeah, yeah, because that was one of the first things that they saw,
Yeah.
was his bombed cathedral, he couldn't help but think of his hometown little country
Yeah.
church, right? Yeah, but yes, his letters did start to change as soon as he started seeing death and destruction. The
Hmm.
destruction was a big part, like the entire communities were bombed, and nothing but desolation everywhere he looked, type of
Hmm.
thing. For the first while, they were much like a lot of guys when they first got there. They didn't go right into combat. They were given almost labor type of
Mm.
jobs where they transported munitions or dug trenches or installed barbed wire or that sort of stuff. So that's what the 18th Battalion did at the very beginning. But it doesn't take long before they get rotated into frontline duty.
Right.
And right at that point, his letters really start to change. And his sisters wrote about a young man in Wallacestown had a car, and he was taking young women for rides.
Mm-hmm.
And Alice's reply was is that a day of reckoning will come for that young man, and why should he reap the reward of
Yeah.
so many others doing their duty, and he's a coward for staying at home, and all of that was extremely uncharacteristic of Ellis Sifton. Like he would never.
He's got the anger and very powerful
Yeah,
emotions, the day of
yeah, and
reckoning,
I
like you said.
imagine he probably already lost friends. Like it didn't
Yeah.
take, it didn't take long for anybody, as soon as they got into the front lines, to start losing people they knew. And yeah, and in fact, a lot of the letters he mentions seeing people who ended up being killed.
Mm.
Um, so, he would have known a lot of people from even his hometown, even though they're thousands of mile away, of them being killed, and he would have got word through the grapevine, type of thing.
Yeah.
His grandmother dies,
Mm.
and his response to the news is he says to his sisters, "Well, you got to expect things like that."
Mm.
right? Whereas before I mean, he was very close to his whole family. And his grandmother dying, if he wasn't there, if the
Yeah.
war never happened, it would have been quite emotional and
Yeah.
devastating. But and again, you expect older people to pass away,
Mhm.
but it was just kind of a callous remark, and I'm sure his sisters thought, that's different, right?
This is not Ellis. Yeah. That's really interesting. So you can see, and it's so amazing that those, like all his correspondence survived, and we can kind of analyze it and look at it and view it as an example of what, trauma does to a person. And again, it's so great that his correspondence is still out there, because you can really see and feel the transformation, which I find so interesting, because he was such a different guy prior to this traumatic experience he went through. And
Yes.
used the right word, like really hardened him. And I can't help but think, how he felt over there with these new emotions, and the anger, and the probably some resentment. You think of the guy driving the girls around back home, and to think of it on a psychological standpoint, like the transformation that Ellis was going through, that he would have probably been very aware of.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And there is another interesting note. In one of his letters, he asked his sister to get their cousin Stuart, who was Stuart Pierce, who lived down the lane, to go into Dutton and get him a pair of high laced boots
Hmm.
and a pair of leather gauntlets made. So, Dutton would have had a cobbler. They would have already had a tracing of Ellis's feet because he
Yeah.
would have made shoes and whatnot. So Stewart went in and had these boots that came up almost to Ellis's knees that laced up made, and a pair of leather gauntlets. And there's a picture of
Hmm.
him. So he's in France, and it's a studio picture, and he has those big tall boots on,
Wow.
and the leather gauntlets are in his looped in his belt, and so they become very important later on with the story of Vimy. You know, things continue on, just kind of what happened to everybody. Continuous in and out of the frontline duty, reverting back out to rest, and then back in front, rest. As Vimy starts to approach, they're seeking information. They
Hmm.
need to know how many German troops are there, where gun positions are, where mortars are, all of those things that they need to know so that Arthur Curry can plan a successful battle.
Right. Trench raids, night raids.
Right. So the reason how they got that information was through trench raids. And
Hmm.
Ellis's platoon, it's their turn
Hmm.
to go on a trench raid. Trench raids were gruesome,
Yeah.
right? They didn't carry guns because if a gun accidentally discharged, then the Germans would know you were there. So
Yeah.
they carried, bats with nails in them, and
Yeah.
homemade brass knuckles, and
Yeah, I was
um,
just going to say the homemade weapons, and I don't think, on a trench raid, aside from the noise and stuff, but you couldn't really bring a gun in, because you were unfortunately so close to the enemy that, a gun would get in the way of taking care of business,
right.
I think.
Yeah, it became an up close and personal thing. His platoon goes in, something goes wrong.
Mm.
I'm not sure exactly what, but the platoon leader is killed, and three men are wounded. And Ellis, who is only a corporal at the time, kind of takes over and successfully not only brings the three wounded, but also guides the rest of the platoon back to their trench and brings German prisoners.
Wow.
So he receives a field promotion and he becomes a lance sergeant.
Right.
And he's also recommended for a medal. But because of what happens later on, that valor recommendation is squashed.
Right. Would that
And
have been the military medal, probably, for
I
bravery?
would think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Because he was an enlisted man, it wouldn't have been the
Mm.
military cross, so it's probably just a military medal.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it would be a distinguished conduct medal or anything like that. But something else happens too. Everybody around Ellis starts looking to him for
Mm.
leadership
Hmm.
because he's proven that he can not only conduct warfare successfully, but he also will get everybody home.
Hmm.
Um, so they get the information. They know where there's a couple of German mortars, which were quite devastating to infantry. And so that was all important information to have. You know, his letters after that trench raid really, really become drastically different, becomes very fatalistic, says a couple of times that he'll never be able to come home. How would he be able to talk to anybody? How would he be able to attend church?
Right.
Nobody at home is going to understand me.
He says often in his correspondence that he straight up he won't be coming home. To
Right.
that effect. He's
Yeah.
very upfront about it.
Yeah, one of his very last letters, he says, I think that my home will be a hole in the ground in either France or Flanders, and seems content with
Mm.
that. There's no fear
Mm.
in the statement. It's just complacency, like this is where
Yeah.
I'm going to go. And I mean, if you think the death toll that went through, I'm sure a lot of guys had that fatalistic feeling, you know.
That could be a whole other podcast, I always say, but that gets into the realm of, the premonitions and all kinds of things, which is very interesting. But and
Yeah,
I
yeah,
wonder with Ellis, was he pragmatic enough to think, my odds of getting out of here are not great? Or was it that and a combination maybe of such a strong faith that he was just accepting of what he felt God was going to dole out to him? You know.
yeah. I think it was probably a combination of the two, you know, just from again seeing so many people die
Hmm.
and it just accepting that, yeah, this was his fate,
Yeah.
and this is what he was meant to do. And so they start gathering for the training for the Vimy assault.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you know they all came together and they practiced walking
Yeah.
to coincide with the creeping barrage and all that sort of stuff. So a lot of different regiments and battalions all of a sudden all came together. 2 days before the Battle of Vimy Ridge, Ellis Sifton runs into his cousin, Len Sifton, who lived in St. Thomas.
How does that
Um,
happen?
yeah, different regiments
Wow.
and you know, up to that point they weren't even in the same sectors basically.
Wow.
And so they have a conversation, and just as Len's getting ready to leave, Ellis Sifton says, "Oh, here, I want you to have my leather gauntlets."
Wow.
And Len's, "Why?" And Ellis just says, "I don't need them anymore. And you take them." Again, it's either premonition of death or almost in his mind that he's going to do something
Yes. He's
that he
he's aware of
doesn't
that. And
know.
it's so interesting to give away leather gauntlets on April 7th when it's not warm, it's still pretty awful weather outside. I mean, we all know that April 9th, the opening day of the Vimy assault, the weather is awful. It's a sleet and snow and a blizzard, and I'm sure
Yeah,
the weather wasn't a heck of a lot prior different, 2 days prior, and he's giving away his gauntlets.
yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
ones that he had custom made, right? And the reason why I know that is because Len Sifton, after Ellis's death, wrote letters to Ellis's sisters telling everything that transpired. And he
Wow.
mentioned that he gave me his gloves. Shortly after that, then Ellis Sifton runs into his neighbor from Wallacestown, Sidney Keeler. And the Keelers were all doctors, but they also owned a cheese factory. and their house side by side. And Sydney was in the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles, not connected in any way.
Yeah.
But again, all the Canadians came together. And so they have a conversation, catch up on, the news of back home and, what have you heard type of thing. And then Sydney's leaving to follow his regiment to the staging area. And Ellis gives him his leather jerkin, that leather vest.
Right.
That, again, that something, in that weather would have been ideal. And Sydney questioned him, why would you do that? And he just says, if I need to look after you, your mother would never forgive me. So again, he's giving away his prized possessions.
Yeah.
When I go to high schools, I always tell the kids it'd be like you giving away your iPhone, right?
Yeah.
Like, and then I also say, if someone's giving away their iPhone, you need to tell somebody.
Yes.
But, so he's giving away his stuff and he's ready to go, and he goes to the staging area, and following day at whatever 4:45 in the morning, the barrage opens up,
Right.
and they
So
start to advance.
before we go right to there,
Yeah.
did he write one final letter home right before the battle? Like, do you know when that?
Yes. The note just says, it's very brief, and it just says, if you don't hear from me, don't worry. I might not be able to write to you. He says, thinking of you all, and then all is well with Ellis tonight.
Yes, I've heard that phrase that he used, that all is well with Ellis. Yeah.
Clearly it wasn't.
No, it's
but
quite
he wouldn't
emotional.
want, right. He wouldn't want his sisters or his father to think of anything else, right? That was going on other than, that everything's well. But it's, I think it's only 4 lines or something like that long. It just says just a few lines to let you know all is well with Ellis tonight. We are having some fine weather and it's drying up. And he says, Sydney is looking about the same as usual, and I have seen cousin Len. And then he says, don't be anxious. If you do not receive any regular news, it is not convenient for me to write. And then at the end he says, they have promoted me to sergeant. So
Okay.
that's it.
Let's move into 0 hour. Why don't we?
Yeah, of course, the whole idea behind the assault on Vimy Ridge was that everybody had to act in unison. That was the importance of learning that Vimy shuffle and continuing with the creeping barrage. As the creeping barrage blew up the wire, and then they would move forward and blow up the wire, move forward, and so on. And it was also important not to become a wedge. Like, everybody had to go up in unison. They didn't want some being left behind or whatever, because as soon as somebody is not moving up in unison, is not continuing on with that creeping barrage, then the German machine gun nests are going to be able to pick you off, because not only does the creeping barrage blow up barbed wire, it also sends up a screen that the Germans can't see through. And if they can't see through, they're not going to be able to shoot you. But if that barrage isn't giving you that shield, then you're in trouble.
Right. I think the timing, wasn't it, they would move like 100 to 150 feet, I think, every 3 minutes.
I think that's about right. Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah, if you move too fast, you'd walk into your own creeping barrage. And if you moved too slow, the Germans would see you and shoot you. I always say, everything was going really well until it wasn't.
Yeah.
And for whatever reason, where Ellis's platoon was, they got held up and they couldn't advance forward. Either the artillery was not placed where it should have, and there was barbed wire in front of them that they would have to go around instead of going straight.
Yep.
And which means they would have had to have wait for those other troops to go forward. And so Ellis's platoon ends up getting stuck in a shell crater. Obviously, everybody there, the genius of the Battle of Vimy was is that everybody knew what had to be done.
Right.
The British, only officers had maps, only officers knew what the objective was, and if the officer died, everybody else was lost. So everybody in that shell hole knew the importance of moving in unison.
Yes, because Curry had
Um,
provided every man with a map after all
right.
that practicing.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a
And
map. Yeah.
everybody seen sand tables
hmm
and, miniature mock-ups of the hills and everything. Everybody knew. And so everybody in that shell hole knew that they had to get out of that shell hole
hmm
and rejoin the rest of the Canadian contingent. But every time, because the barrage wasn't offering them the shield,
hmm
every time one of them got up out of that shell crater and tried to move forward, they got shot.
Right.
So I think Ellis's tolerance for seeing his friends killed probably would have been very
Mm.
minuscule.
Yeah.
And so he told everybody to stay put, and he jumped up out of that shell hole and started running up the ridge.
Right. Because
Um,
they were stuck in there because there was a machine gun nest. They were just being strafed, like
right.
just
Yeah,
you know.
there was a machine gun nest right in front of them.
Yeah.
So they were basically pinned down.
Right.
So yeah, Alice jumps up out of the shell hole and starts running directly at a German machine gun nest. The thing about his action is it was probably one of the most well documented Victoria Crosses ever
hmm
because everybody saw it happen. Everybody saw this lone figure running up a
Right.
hill. Everybody else was doing this Vimy shuffle, and Ellis is running up the
Wow.
hill ahead of everybody, determined to stop that German machine gun.
He's just had enough, it sounds like.
Yeah, absolutely. Had enough. It'd be miraculous if he didn't get hit, but again, there's no information of him being hit because once he was killed, there was no autopsy that said, oh, there was a.
Good point. I had never considered that he could, and I wouldn't be surprised at all, he could very well have been hit on his way forward to take care of that machine gun nest and just out of pure, I'm done with you guys,
Right.
probably would
And
have continued barreling forward.
right.
So,
He was running on adrenaline and
yes.
nothing. Yeah. Pure gasoline. And he runs up the hill and dives headfirst through the slit that's on the
hmm
front of the German machine gun nest and comes rolling up in front of these stunned Germans. And I've always thought, like, I can only imagine what went through these men's mind.
Yeah.
Germans were already afraid of Canadians. They were, they thought we were all devils and, you
Crazy.
know, crazy and ate raw meat and all this
Yeah.
stuff. And all of a sudden there's this, and they would have saw him running at them too, right? Like looking through that slit and seeing this person getting closer and closer and closer,
Yeah.
and all of
This
a sudden
crazy
he's in
Canuck.
amongst, yeah.
And so there were in that
um,
in that machine gun nest, there were 6 or 7 Germans, right?
yes,
That he
yeah,
rushed.
yeah. And so they're all in there, and he took them all out. How he did that, again, it's not documented, but
Yeah.
he had was his Lee Enfield Mark III,
hmm
um, and with a 16-inch bayonet on the end. That's the
Yeah.
only thing he had. Either he shot them all, or bayoneted them all,
hmm
or clubbed them all. But
Yeah.
that machine gun was no longer functional. It had stopped firing. Enough for Ellis to stick his upper body out of that slit
Yep.
and wave everybody up. And when he did that, a celebration, it's like somebody running the winning touchdown. Everybody, because again, everybody saw it.
Yeah.
All these other officers and enlisted men and everybody, they
hmm
saw him running up the hill. They saw him dive into that machine gun nest. And then all of a sudden, that machine gun was no longer firing. Everybody was congratulating him and cheering him and yelling his name. And his men got up out of that crater and started running up to give him support. They got there. Ellis had climbed out of the machine gun nest, and a German officer rolled over, pulled out his Luger, fired, hit Ellis in the head, and killed him instantly.
That was that. A wounded German officer, like you say, rolled over and took aim. And so in this moment, I think, like I've read things, and I'm hoping you can confirm, in that moment, you know, even Ellis's CO arrived on scene and was that moment of victory.
Yes. Ellis's sisters received numerous letters, not only from their cousin Len and from Sidney, who also, so Sidney Keeler, the neighbor, also saw it happen. And he wrote, Ellis's commanding officer wrote, and just some other men who served with Ellis. They all wrote to his sisters, and the story is very, very consistent. This is what happened. So a Victoria Cross, you have to be recommended, and then it goes through a review panel, and then it's either granted or denied, and you get a lesser medal,
right?
Like a conspicuous gallantry medal or distinguished conduct medal or whatever. But everybody was so positive of Ellis's actions that even his temporary grave marker, you know, that white triangle wooden, has his name on it. At the very bottom, it says VC.
Okay.
So
no question.
No question. When they buried him temporarily, it was absolutely, this guy is being granted the VC or else.
Or there's going to be a problem. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It's a sad story, and it's, you know, it's also a story of man's endurance, of what they're capable of, and his determination throughout. I see a man who was determined to not do things for himself, but to do things for others.
And on that note, in his hometown there, where you reside, for the longest time, there was no memorial. There was
nothing at all. It's a very small community. This little community lost 8 men at Vimy Ridge. Now, Sidney Keeler is one of those 8, and he didn't die until later, but he died from the wounds received at Vimy. And he lingered in a hospital for about 6 weeks, and then he died.
Okay.
But still, so 8 men die one day in this community, and there wouldn't have been anybody in the whole town that wasn't affected in some way. And it would have been a very dark day, right? And then by war end, it's lost 33 people from this little community. I set out almost instantly to do something about that. And the first thing I did was I had the signs that say, "Welcome to Wallacestown." So there's 4 of them. It's like 4 corners is the town. So I had the signs remade. The sign says, "Welcome to Wallacestown." And in the middle is a picture of the Vimy Memorial. And then at the bottom, it says, "The birthplace of Ellis Wellwood Sifton, Victoria Cross recipient, Vimy Ridge."
That's awesome.
So that was the first thing that I did. But, you know, there's all these other guys, right? There's 31 other from World War I, and there's 15 from World War II, and there's no recognition of any of them. And I mean, there's military cross recipients, there's military medal recipients, distinguished flying crosses, right? And so they asked me to speak at a Remembrance Day ceremony. So I went, and it was on a Friday night, the Friday before November 11th. It was in the community center. And it was very well attended. There was probably 100 people there. And then they hung wreaths on a 2x4 frame in the community center. And so it didn't have the grandeur that these men deserve.
Yeah.
I would say they gave their today for our tomorrow. And so hanging a wreath on a 2x4 frame just wasn't cutting it for me.
No.
So I went to a council meeting and I brought it up. They said, well, if you want to do something about it, go ahead. Right? They weren't
Okay.
they weren't going to do it. So I started thinking about people in the community that were like-minded. And yeah, I went and talked to Optimists and Lions and Legions and,
Hmm.
Rotary clubs and Masons, Knights of Columbus, like every
Everybody.
organization I could think of. And within a year, we raised $150,000.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
That
And
is
so
for a small municipality. That is absolutely.
I was amazed a lot of people, even though it happened so long ago, a lot of people still remembered the guys who were from World War II who lost their lives. So community really came together. Yeah.
Yeah. So this cenotaph, it's you mentioned it's kind of got this very unique design. It's sort of a, I don't want to say like a half circle, but like an arc, almost like a C shape if you
Yes.
viewed it from above, and the names are on there. And has it got the names from the Second World War as well?
Yeah. First World War and the Second World War. And then on the one arm, just wrote a dedication to the peacekeepers and said
Hmm.
how this community has always sent its young men and women to help where help was needed and to
Right.
wherever there was strife. Young men and women from this community, treasuring their serenity that we have, went to ensure that others had the same opportunity. And so that's on the one side. And then on the other side, it lists it's World War One, World War Two, Korea. Again, we didn't lose anyone in Korea, but we did have uh, men who served in Korea and Afghanistan. And we didn't
Hmm.
lose anyone in Afghanistan, but served. So the cenotaph isn't only to recognize the dead, but it's also for everybody who ever served a place where they can go and reflect. And then on top, there's a granite helmet leaning against a granite cross. And then
Okay.
on the back is Binion's stanza, old they
Yes.
shall not grow, time shall not weary them. So
We
that's
will
incredible.
remember them. Pretty impressive legacy.
Thanks.
And
Yeah. Uh,
I'm nowhere near Ontario, but I want to thank you for taking the initiative, and I thank you for setting up that cenotaph and that legacy in Wallacestown to
right.
remember these guys, not just Sifton, but all of them who went, and maybe they came home, maybe they didn't, but these sacrifices, yeah, really important.
Yeah. Yeah,
Really.
there's a lot of amazing stories. There's a book that accompanies the cenotaph. So it's got
Hmm.
the story of not only everybody who's on the cenotaph, but everybody who enlisted. And there's a lot of amazing stories. Yeah,
What is the title of that book?
it is the Dutton Dunwich Book of Remembrance.
Okay,
Yeah.
World War One and World War Two, it says. But I wanted to deviate a little bit. One thing we didn't talk about today was the house that Sifton's dad and family just abandoned.
Oh,
So if you
right.
can tell
Yeah.
me a little, because his correspondence was found in the house in which he lived. So if you can kind of tell us the story behind that.
So when Ellis's father, John, got the telegram stating that Ellis had been killed, he
Mhm.
left. He just left the house. I mean, this was his livelihood,
Yeah.
right? This was like a farm and this is what he did. But he couldn't be there anymore. He couldn't eat off dishes that his son had used. He couldn't sit on a couch that Ellis had sit on.
Yeah.
He couldn't go to the barn. He couldn't be in the fields.
Mm.
It was his only son, and they were obviously very close, and he couldn't deal with it, right? And so he
So he
left,
and his
and
daughters just
so
literally
him and
just,
his two daughters, they left everything,
wow.
and they just moved to
Okay.
Dutton. They bought a house, and he went into that house and went upstairs into his bedroom and didn't come out until they removed him
Yeah.
in a
How
box.
many years later?
Yeah.
How many years did he grieve up in that bedroom?
Oh, yeah. It was a long time. I think yeah,
31 years.
yeah, yeah. And his daughters just looked after him. A family by the name of Bovier bought the
Hmm?
farm. And when they went in, of course, it's full of like dressers and beds and everything. And they're cleaning it out. And they opened up a dresser, and inside was this stack of letters with twine
Wow.
tied around it. And so not only was there the letters that Ellis wrote, but the letter from their cousin Len Sifton, letter from their neighbor Sidney Keeler, a letter from Ellis's commanding officer, his
Wow.
comrades. So all of these letters were in one chunk,
Yeah.
and thank God the Bobiers had enough foresight to say this needs to go to a
Hmm.
museum, right? And so they took it to St. Thomas and handed it in at the Elgin County Military
And
Museum.
that's where they are now. That's where they
Yeah,
stay.
yeah, that's where they are now.
Wow. How
Um,
long was that house vacant before the Beaubiers purchased the property? Like, is it one of those stories where it sat
like
there for,
45,
it
45
did, it
years.
sat there for 45 years, unvandalized.
Yeah, but the only thing that the sisters kept were his
Yeah.
medals.
That's amazing. You are a
Yeah,
fantastic storyteller, fantastic historian. Just, I've spoken with you. This is the second time because, we won't talk
yeah,
about the first time, but really interesting to chat with you and listen to the way you kind of tell this story. It's captivating, and just to pick out, like, there's so many moments in Ellis's story that are like, you got to be kidding me. It's quite a story. And I love the way you tell it. And I
yeah.
want to thank you for sharing it with me and on this podcast on Memory and Valor, so all those listeners out there can listen to the way you relate this really incredible story.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate
Oh,
that. And yeah,
yeah. Well,
anytime.
thank you for joining me. We'll definitely do some more podcasts, and
Sure.
I think we'll sign it off here officially for the podcast. So we're off
Okay.
the air. Uh, I think it
Okay.
went well. When I move my mouse around, I can see it. All right, that was an absolute blast, and that was actually the second time that Blair and I had a visit via Zoom. Really interesting, great guy. And I want to thank him again for sharing his knowledge and for the work he's done to ensure Ellis Sifton's story is remembered. And to you listening, thank you for spending this hour or so with us. Ellis Sifton was just a young man from a small community. He did what he thought was right. He lived a quiet life. But when the moment came, he acted with extraordinary courage. His story survived because his sisters kept his letters and because a house sat untouched for decades. Because people like Blair cared enough to dig deeper, and because communities like Dutton Dunwich believe in honoring their own. So if you ever find yourself in the area, stop by the new cenotaph and just stand for a moment. Read the names and remember the young men, including Ellis Wellwood Sifton, whose courage helped shape the country we live in today. This has been Memory and Valor. Keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.